The Missouri River ran brown and restless between banks of cottonwood and willow when the mapmaker arrived at the trading post called Fort Carondelet. 2 days' paddle upstream from St. Louis, the place was no true fort, just a cluster of log buildings huddled against the current, their foundations sunk deep into the mud to keep them from floating away when the spring floods came. Spanish claimed the land on paper, but few flags flew. The old fleur-de-lis had long faded from memory, and the red and gold banner of Spain rose only when the commandant remembered to hoist it on feast days or when a boat from New Orleans brought dispatches. To the French habitants who still spoke the old tongue among themselves, to the Osage hunters who came down from the tall grass prairies with packs of beaver and deer hides, to the handful of American trappers drifting west after the Revolution had left them restless, it was simply the post on the Osage. I write this as one who saw the beginning of what became the end, though my name matters little now. Call me Jean-Baptiste Laveau, once a voyageur in the service of the Missouri Company, later a man who carried ink and parchment instead of pelts and powder. My hand shakes as I set these words down by the light of a single candle, the wind rattling the shutters of a cabin far from that river. Years later, when the memory still burns, if thou readest this, stranger, know that I tell it not for fame nor for absolution, but that the tale may outlive the silence that tried to swallow it whole. Knowledge, they say, is a lamp in the dark. On that river in those days, it became a blade sharper than any scalping knife. The trouble began with Monsieur Etienne de la Roche. He arrived in late spring on a keelboat that had fought the current for weeks, thin as a reed after the journey, spectacles perched on a nose already burned by the sun, carrying rolls of heavy paper tied with twine, a case of quills, bottles of ink wrapped in oilcloth, and a brass theodolite that gleamed like treasure even in the dull light of the post's yard. The company had hired him, on orders from the Spanish governor in New Orleans, to chart the Missouri beyond the Osage villages. Every bend of the river, every tributary that snaked into the hills, every meadow where lead ore might lie beneath the grass, or beaver might dam a stream. The governor wanted lines on paper, clear boundaries for land grants to loyal subjects, safe routes for trade caravans, proof carved in ink that Upper Louisiana belonged to Spain, and not to the restless Americans who crossed the Mississippi in flatboats, or to the British who still crept down from Canada with their rum and their red coats hidden under civilian wool. De la Roche was courteous in the way of educated men from the cities. He spoke passable French with a soft southern accent, paid in silver reales that rang true when dropped on the counter, and never raised his voice even when the mosquitoes feasted on his arms until they swelled like ripe plums. At first, the men liked him well enough. He shared his brandy around the evening fire, laughed quietly at their stories of near drownings and bear encounters, and asked questions without pressing too hard. He listened more than he spoke, nodded at the right moments, and drew with a hand so steady it seemed the quill moved of its own will. But he drew everything, not just the wide sweep of the river or the bluffs that rose red and raw on the northern bank. He marked the Osage hunting grounds where the deer trails converged like veins, the salt licks hidden in shallow draws where the herds came at dusk, the hidden springs the old hunters guarded like family secrets passed only to sons. He asked the voyageurs where the best beaver streams ran clear and deep. They told him, thinking it idle talk over tobacco. He asked the Osage where the buffalo crossed in autumn when the grass turned gold. They answered at first with gestures and a few words, proud to show their knowledge to a man who seemed to respect it. He wrote it all down. Every line, every symbol, every tiny notation in the margins. Good grass here, ford shallow there, village of 30 lodges 2 leagues inland. I watched him one evening by the riverbank as the sun sank low and red across the water, turning the current to molten copper. His quill scratched steadily across the large sheet spread on a flat stone. Two Osage men, brothers named Tall Elk and Little Smoke, sat nearby on a fallen log, smoking a pipe carved from red pipestone. They had guided him for 3 days through the timbered hills, showing him paths no white man had walked without permission, paths their fathers had walked, and their fathers before them. De la Roche smiled as he worked, thanked them again in halting Osage phrases he had learned from a trader, and added another faint line to his map, a narrow trail leading to a valley they called the Place of Many Buffalo, where the herds gathered before the first snow and the hunting was richest. The brothers saw the mark appear beneath his quill. Their faces changed, not anger, not yet, but something colder, deeper, like a river freezing from the bottom up. Knowledge shared freely among kin is one thing, knowledge taken by a stranger, fixed forever on paper, and carried away where it can be sold or used against you, that is another matter entirely. That night the post grew quiet earlier than usual. The men drank less, spoke less, stared into the fire as though answers might rise from the coals. I lay in my bunk, listening to the river lap against the pilings, the creak of logs settling in the damp, the distant howl of wolves calling back and forth across the prairie. Somewhere in the dark an owl called, short, sharp, insistent. Not the long, mournful hoot of the great horned owl that carries messages from the dead, but the barred owl's cry repeated like a question that expects no answer. Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you? The sound seemed to come from every direction at once, as though the bird circled the post just beyond the lantern light. The next morning de la Roche was gone from his cabin before dawn. We found his bedroll untouched, the blankets still folded with military precision, his theodolite still wrapped in oilcloth on the table beside an empty ink bottle. But the large map, the one he had labored over for weeks, the one that showed the river from St. Louis all the way to the distant Mandan villages far upstream, was missing. Only a single page torn from his journal remained, weighted by a smooth river stone. On it, in his neat, careful hand, I have taken only what is mine. The rest I leave to those who will use it wisely. No tracks led away from the post. The river was high with meltwater from the north, the banks soft and treacherous. A man could step into the shallows and vanish without leaving a print. Yet we searched. The commandant, a weary Spaniard named Don Carlos de Holt de Lassus, ordered every able man out. We rode upriver a mile, downriver 2, combed the willows and the cottonwood groves, pushed through thickets where thorns tore at our sleeves. Nothing. No broken branch, no scrap of cloth, no sign that a man had passed that way. The map was gone, and so was he. Don Carlos ordered the post locked down. No one in, no one out, until the mystery cleared or new orders came from below. The voyageurs grumbled. They had pelts to sell and families waiting in St. Louis. The Osage who had come to trade turned their canoes around without unloading, their faces closed. Suspicion settled over the place like river fog that refuses to burn off even at noon. That evening, as the sun bled into the water and the mosquitoes rose in clouds, I walked the perimeter alone. Near the flat stone where de la Roche had last drawn, half buried in the mud, I found something, a single brass button from his coat, the kind stamped with the faint outline of the Spanish crown. It lay as though dropped in haste, or placed there deliberately, a marker for someone who knew where to look. I picked it up. The metal was still warm, as though it had been held in a closed hand only moments before. Behind me, from the trees across the river, the barred owl called again. Closer this time. Who cooks for you? I slipped the button into my pocket and returned to the post. The men were gathering in the main room, voices low, faces hard in the lantern light. They wanted answers. They wanted someone to blame. And somewhere in the gathering dark, a map was moving, lines on paper that could open hidden valleys to traders and soldiers, close ancient trails to those who had walked them since time out of mind, start small wars over beaver streams or lead deposits, or end lives with the quiet stroke of a quill. If this forgotten account of a single line drawn in ink and blood stirs thee, reader, then pray subscribe. Give it thy like, thy comment, and share it abroad, that others may know what it cost to hold knowledge on a frontier where trust was thinner than parchment and sharper than regret. The days after De La Roche vanished stretched thin and taut, like a bowstring drawn too long. The post remained locked, gates barred with heavy timbers, sentries doubled on the river wall, no canoes allowed to leave or approach without inspection. Don Carlos de Hol de Lassus paced the narrow yard between the storehouse and the command cabin, his boots cutting fresh grooves in the dust. He had sent a rider downriver to St. Louis with a terse report. Map maker missing, valuable chart stolen, possible desertion or foul play. But the message would take days to reach the governor and weeks for any reply. In the meantime, the silence grew heavier than the summer heat. The men whispered in corners. Some said De La Roche had slipped away in the night, paid by American agents to carry the map east across the Mississippi, where land speculators waited to carve up the territory before Spain could claim it. Others swore he had drowned himself in shame or fear, the river claiming both man and parchment. A few, those who had drunk with him and liked his quiet ways, muttered that the Osage had taken him, that Tall Elk and Little Smoke had seen the betrayal in the new lines on paper, and decided no white man should carry such knowledge away. I kept the brass button in my pocket, turning it over in my fingers when no one watched. It felt heavier than brass should, as though it carried the weight of the question it answered. Who cooks for you? The barred owl had not called again that night, but the absence felt deliberate, like a hunter waiting for the prey to relax. On the third day, the first sign appeared. It was morning, the mist still thick on the river, when one of the sentries, young Pierre Dubois, barely 20 and still soft from city life, shouted from the northern bastion. We ran up the ladder to find him pointing at the outer face of the palisade. There, carved shallow into the logs with something sharp, a knife, perhaps, or the point of a tomahawk, were 3 words in French, uneven but legible. La carte parle. The map speaks. The letters were fresh, the wood chips still pale against the weathered gray. No ladder marks beneath, no footprints in the soft earth below. The river lapped at the base of the wall. Anyone coming by water could have reached it unseen in the dark. Yet the carving had been done with care, each letter deliberate, as though the maker had time and no fear of discovery. Don Carlos stared at the words a long moment, then ordered them scraped away with an axe. Pierre and 2 others set to work, the chips flying like snow. When they finished, the logs were scarred but blank. Still the phrase lingered in every conversation, repeated half in jest, half in dread. That afternoon the Osage returned. Not Tall Elk and Little Smoke this time, but an older man, Gray Owl, a respected elder whose face bore the scars of smallpox from the great sickness 10 years before. He came alone in a small dugout, no trade goods, no escort. The sentries let him through the gate after a search. He carried only a pipe and a small pouch of tobacco. He met Don Carlos in the yard, speaking through a half-breed interpreter named Antoine, who had lived among the Osage since childhood. Gray Owl's voice was low, steady, without anger or pleading. The map-maker walked paths that were not his to walk, Antoine translated. He took lines that belonged to the people. Now those lines move. They speak to those who listen. If the white men keep searching for the man, they will find only what the lines wish them to find. Don Carlos asked if Grey Owl knew where De La Roche had gone. The elder shook his head once. He is where the river decides. But the map is not with him. It has found new hands. He looked directly at me then, though I stood at the edge of the circle. His eyes were dark, unreadable. He said something in Osage that Antoine hesitated to repeat. The barred owl asks a question, Antoine said at last. It asks who will answer. Grey Owl left without another word, paddling back into the mist. The men watched him go, silent. That night I could not sleep. The heat pressed down, the mosquitoes sang against the netting. I rose, slipped outside, and walked to the riverbank where De La Roche had last drawn. The flat stone still lay there, unmarked now. I sat upon it, staring at the water. The barred owl called once, twice from the opposite bank. Closer than before. Who cooks for you? I answered aloud, though I felt foolish. I do not know. The call came again, sharper, almost impatient. Then silence. The next morning we found the second sign. In the center of the parade ground, where the men usually gathered for roll call, someone had arranged small stones in the shape of a rough map. A long winding line for the Missouri, smaller curves for tributaries, a cluster of dots for the Osage villages, and an X at the place of many buffalo. Beside the X lay a single feather, barred, brown and white, still damp as though freshly plucked. No one claimed the work. No tracks marred the dust around it. The stones had been placed in the night, while sentries walked only paces away. Don Carlos ordered the arrangement scattered. We kicked the stones apart, scattered the feather into the river. But the shape remained in our minds, clearer than any carving. The whispers began in earnest then. Men swore they heard voices beneath the owl's call, soft, overlapping, speaking in French and Osage and something older. They spoke of hidden lead mines, of beaver streams so rich a man could grow wealthy in a season, of trails that led to valleys where no white man had yet set foot. The voices promised riches to those who followed, warned death to those who tried to stop them. I heard them too, though I told no one. One night, standing watch on the river wall, the barred owl called from the willows directly below me. The question came again, but this time it carried my name woven into it, faint but unmistakable. Who cooks for you, Jean-Baptiste? My skin went cold. I raised my musket, sighted into the dark. The call came once more, mocking. I lowered the weapon. I could not shoot the night itself. The next day, the post's interpreter, Antoine, disappeared. He had gone to the latrine at dusk and never returned. We searched the grounds, the riverbank, the nearby woods. Nothing. Only his pipe lay on the path, still warm, tobacco ash scattered like gray snow. Don Carlos posted extra guards, forbade any man to leave the walls alone. But the fear had taken root. Men slept with knives under their pillows, muskets loaded beside their bunks. Friendships frayed, glances turned suspicious. And every night the barred owl circled closer, its question echoing across the water. Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you? I began to understand. The map was not just lines on paper. It had become a living thing, moving through the hands of those who coveted it, whispering secrets that should have stayed buried. Knowledge, once freed, does not return to silence easily. And somewhere along that river, the map was still speaking. The barred owl's call no longer came from the trees across the river. It moved inside the post, or so it seemed. One man would hear it from the rafters of the barracks. Another swore it echoed from the empty powder magazine. A third claimed the sound rose from beneath the floorboards of the storehouse, as though the bird had burrowed into the earth itself. The question remained the same. Who cooks for you? But now it carried fragments of other voices beneath it, faint and overlapping, like men speaking through water. Pierre Dubois was the first to speak openly of it. He had stood the midnight watch on the river wall, musket across his knees, when the call came from directly below him. He leaned over the palisade, lantern raised, and saw nothing but black water and the pale blur of willows. Yet the question rose clear, and beneath it words he recognized, his own name, spoken in his mother's voice, the way she had called him to supper when he was small in Montreal. Pierre dropped his lantern. The glass shattered. The flame hissed out in the damp. He ran back to the barracks, woke half the men, swearing the owl had learned to speak French. The others listened in the dim light of the single candle they dared keep burning. Some laughed at first, nervous, brittle laughs, but the laughter died when Antoine's pipe was found the next morning on the path to the latrine, still warm, as though he had set it down only moments before vanishing. We searched again, wider this time, pushing through the thickets until thorns drew blood. Nothing. Only the pipe, and beside it a single barred feather pressed into the mud, quill pointing toward the river like an arrow. Don Carlos ordered the feather burned. We watched it curl and blacken in the fire pit, the smoke rising thin and acrid, but the scent lingered, wild, sharp, like wet feathers and distant prairie grass. The voices grew bolder. They came not only with the owl's call now, but in the quiet moments between, when a man sat alone sharpening his knife, when another lay awake staring at the ceiling beams, when the wind died and the river ran smooth. They spoke of things only the map could know. To one voyageur they whispered the exact location of a beaver pond hidden behind a bluff, where pelts were thick and black. To another they named a lead deposit in a dry creek bed, or so pure it gleamed like silver in the sun. The promises were sweet, tempting, the kind that make a poor man dream of wealth. But always the question returned, who cooks for you? And always, beneath it, the implication, someone must pay the price. I began to avoid being alone. I stayed near the fire, near the other men, though trust had thinned to a thread. Eyes followed me now, suspicious because I had been the one to find the button, because I had walked with De La Roche on his last evening, because I had answered the owl aloud that night on the riverbank. They did not accuse me, not yet, but the silence between words grew pointed. One afternoon, as thunderheads built dark in the west, Don Carlos called me to his cabin. The room smelled of tobacco and old paper. Maps of his own, crude, hand-drawn, covered the table. He sat behind them, coat unbuttoned, face lined deeper than when the mapmaker had arrived. "Laveau," he said, voice low, "thou hast seen more than most. Speak plain. Dost thou believe the map lives?" I hesitated. The question sounded mad when spoken aloud, yet I could not deny what I had heard. "I believe knowledge does not die easily, mon commandant," I answered. "Once set free, it finds its way. Perhaps the map has found hands that know how to use it." He studied me a long moment. "And the voices? The owl?" "I hear them too," I admitted. "They speak my name sometimes. They ask the question." Don Carlos leaned back, rubbed his eyes. "Then we are all hearing ghosts, or perhaps not ghosts at all. Perhaps someone among us has the map and uses it to torment the rest." The thought had crossed my mind more than once. Who better to whisper secrets than one who held the paper itself? That night the storm broke. Rain hammered the roofs, turned the yard to mud, drowned the river's usual murmur in a steady roar. Lightning split the sky. Thunder rolled like cannon across the prairie. We huddled in the barracks, muskets close, listening to the wind tear at the shutters. In the worst of it, when the lightning flashed brightest, I saw him. Through the gap in the door, only for an instant, illuminated white against the dark, he stood at the edge of the yard. Thin, spectacles catching the flash, coat sodden and clinging. Etienne de la Roche. He looked directly at me, raised one hand as though in greeting, then turned and walked into the storm toward the river. I bolted upright, heart slamming. There, by the gate. The men scrambled, muskets raised. We threw open the door, rain lashing our faces. Nothing, only mud and wind and the river roaring high. Don Carlos appeared behind us, lantern shielded. "What didst thou see?" "The map maker," I said, standing there. He looked at me. The commandant stared into the dark. Then he turned to the men. "Search the post, every cabin, every corner. If he is here, if anyone has hidden him or his map, we end this tonight." We searched by lantern light, rain dripping from our hats. We tore through bunks, overturned crates, pried up floorboards in the storehouse. Nothing. No map. No De La Roche. Only the same emptiness that had grown since he vanished. But in my own bunk, beneath the thin mattress where I kept my few possessions, we found something new. A scrap of paper torn from a larger sheet, folded small. When I opened it, my breath caught. It was a fragment of De La Roche's map, the upper right corner showing the place of Many Buffalo and the trail leading to it. In the margin, in his neat hand, a single line added after his disappearance. "They will come for this. Do not let them have it." The ink was fresh, still faintly glossy. The men crowded around, faces pale in the lantern glow. Someone muttered a curse. Another crossed himself. Don Carlos took the fragment, studied it, then looked at me. "Thou sayest thou saw him. Now this appears in thy bunk. Explain." "I cannot," I said. "I swear it was not there when I rose for watch." He folded the paper carefully, placed it in his coat. Then someone placed it there, or something. Outside, the storm began to ease. The rain slackened to a steady patter. And from somewhere beyond the palisade, closer than ever, the barred owl called once, slow and deliberate. "Who cooks for you?" The question hung in the wet air, unanswered, but I knew deep in my bones that the map was no longer just paper. It had become a summons, and the voices beneath the question were growing impatient. They wanted their answer. The fragment of the map remained in Don Carlos's coat pocket, close against his chest like a secret he dared not speak aloud. He showed it to no one else after that night, but we all knew it existed. The men watched him the way one watches a man carrying gunpowder through a dry camp. Careful, wary, waiting for the spark. The storm had passed, leaving the air thick and clean, the river swollen and restless. Mud clung to everything, boots, hems, the lower logs of the palisade. The post smelled of wet earth and wet wool, and the faint, lingering rot of fear. No one slept soundly anymore. The barred owl called every night now, never far, never close enough to shoot. The question came in different voices, sometimes a child's, sometimes an old woman's, sometimes my own mother's, long dead in Quebec. Beneath each call, the whispers grew clearer, more insistent. They no longer only promised riches, they demanded payment. A beaver stream for a life, a lead deposit for a betrayal, the place of Many Buffalo for silence. The map, they said, would not rest until its balance was settled. On the 5th day after the storm, the 3rd sign appeared. It was dawn, the sky still bruised purple in the east. Pierre Dubois climbed the ladder to the southern bastion for his watch, and froze at the top. He did not shout this time. He simply stood, mouth open, until another man noticed and called the rest of us up. Carved into the inner face of the palisade, inside the post where only our own eyes could see, were new words, deep and fresh, the wood still bleeding sap. Un doit payer. One must pay. Below the words, etched smaller but unmistakable, was a single name, Laveau. My name. The men turned to me as one. No words at first, only the slow shift of suspicion into certainty. Pierre's hand rested on his musket butt. Another voyageur, old Marcel, who had lost a brother to the river years before, spat into the dust. Don Carlos arrived last, coat still damp from the night, face unreadable. He read the carving without expression, then looked at me. "Thou hast an explanation, Laveau?" "I have none," I said, voice steady though my pulse hammered in my throat. "I stood no watch last night. I slept, or tried to, in the barracks with 10 others. If someone carved this, they did it while we breathed around them." Marcel stepped forward. "And the fragment in thy bunk, the button thou found, the way the owl speaks thy name?" "I did not place them," I answered. "Nor did I carve my own name to accuse myself. If the map speaks, it speaks through someone here, or through something that walks among us." Don Carlos raised a hand. "Enough. We will not tear ourselves apart on whispers and wood scratches. Laveau, thou wilt be confined to the storehouse until we know more. The rest, double watches, no man alone. If the map is here, we will find it. If the map maker walks, we will see him again." They marched me to the storehouse, a low building of logs and sod roof near the river wall. Inside, barrels of cornmeal half empty, sacks of salt pork gone green at the edges, a few crates of trade goods, beads, mirrors, knives, meant for the Osage. They barred the door from outside, left one small window unshuttered for air. I sat on a crate in the dim light, listening to the river and the footsteps fading away. Hours passed. The sun climbed, heat built inside the small space. I paced the narrow floor, turned the brass button over in my palm until it warmed to my skin. The whispers came then, not through the owl, but directly into my ear, soft as breath. "Jean-Baptiste." I froze. The voice was de la Roche's. Calm, measured, the same tone he had used when thanking the Osage for their guidance. "Thou hast seen the map. Thou knowest its weight." "I have seen only scraps," I whispered back, though no one could hear me but the dust motes in the light. "I have not taken it, but thou couldst. The place of many buffalo waits, lead in the creek bed, beaver thick as leaves in autumn, all for one answer. Who cooks for you?" I said aloud, mocking the question. The voice laughed, soft, without humor. "One must pay. The map will not rest until the debt is settled. Answer and walk free with riches. Refuse, and the post falls with thee." I pressed my hands to my ears. The voice faded, but the question lingered, echoing inside my skull. That evening they let me out for water and a meal. The yard was empty, save for 2 sentries. Don Carlos waited by the fire pit, arms crossed. "Anything to say?" he asked. I met his eyes. The voices speak to me now. They offer the map's secrets if I answer the question. He studied me. "And what is thy answer?" "I have none yet." He nodded once. "Then keep it. But know this. If the carving was no trick, if the map truly moves, then the one who holds it will not stop until someone pays. Perhaps thou, perhaps me, perhaps all of us." He turned away. The sentries led me back to the storehouse. Night fell heavy. The barred owl called from the riverbank. Once, twice, then a third time. Closer, almost at the wall. The question rang clear across the water. "Who cooks for you?" I stood at the small window, staring into the dark. Lightning bugs drifted like slow sparks. Then I saw it. A shape moving along the palisade, low and careful. Thin, coat trailing. Spectacles glinting once in the faint moonlight. De la Roche, or his likeness, slipped past the sentry's blind spot, paused at the storehouse wall, and pressed something through the narrow gap beneath the door. I waited until the footsteps faded, then reached down. A folded paper. The rest of the map. I opened it by the thin moonlight. The Missouri wound across the sheet, tributaries branching like veins. Osage villages marked with tiny lodges, the place of many buffalo circled in fresh ink. In the margin, one last note. "Answer, or the owl will answer for thee." The barred owl called again, right outside the wall now. "Who cooks for you, Jean-Baptiste?" I folded the map, tucked it inside my shirt. My hand closed around the brass button in my pocket. I knew then what the price would be. One must pay, and the map had chosen who. Dawn came slow and gray the morning after the map found its way beneath the storehouse door. The river had risen overnight, lapping at the lower logs until the western wall stood half in water. Mist hung thick over the yard, muffling sound, making every footstep seem distant and deliberate. I had not slept. The folded map lay against my chest like a cold hand. The brass button burned in my pocket as though freshly cast. The barred owl had fallen silent after its last question, but the silence felt worse, waiting, expectant, like the moment before a rifle cracks. They came for me at first light. 2 sentries, Pierre and old Marcel, unbarred the door without a word. Their faces were hard, eyes red from lack of sleep. They led me out into the yard where the men had gathered in a loose circle around the fire pit. Don Carlos stood at the center, coat buttoned high, the map fragment visible now in his hand like evidence at a trial. "Laveau," he said, voice carrying clear across the damp air. "The carving named thee. The voices speak to thee. The map came to thee. Speak now. Hast thou hidden it? Hast thou answered the question?" I looked at each face in turn, suspicion, fear, exhaustion. No one spoke for me. The river murmured behind us, patient. "I have the map," I said. "It came under the door last night. De la Roche, or what looked like him, placed it there." A murmur ran through the men. Marcel stepped forward, hand on his knife. "Then give it up. Let us burn it and be done." I reached inside my shirt, drew out the folded sheet. The paper had grown damp from my skin, ink smudged in places but still legible. I held it up so all could see, the winding Missouri, the tributaries, the circled valley, the fresh note in the margin. "They will not let it burn," I said. "The map speaks. It demands an answer. One must pay." Don Carlos took a step closer. "And what is thy answer, Laveau?" I looked at him, then at the river. The mist parted for a moment, revealing the far bank where willows stood black against the gray sky. From somewhere in their depths the barred owl called once, soft, final. "Who cooks for you?" I answered. "I do," I said. The words hung in the air. The men stared. Don Carlos's hand tightened on the map fragment. "I take the debt," I continued. "The map's secrets are mine to carry. I will take it away from here, north, to the Osage villages, or west, beyond the prairie. I will give it back to those whose paths it stole. If the voices want payment, they will have it from me alone. The post lives, the rest of you live." Marcel laughed, short and bitter. "Thou wouldst walk out with the map and leave us to the silence?" "I would," I said, "because if I stay, the question never ends. It will carve more names. It will whisper more promises. It will bring more shapes in the storm. One must pay. Let it be me." Don Carlos studied me a long moment. Then he nodded once, slow. "Take it," he said. "Go. But know this, if thou returnest, or if the voices follow thee back, we will shoot on sight." I folded the map again, tucked it away. No one moved to stop me. They watched as I walked to the river gate, unbarred it myself. The water had risen to my knees. The current pulled at my legs like eager hands. I stepped in, waded out until the river took me to the waist, then to the chest. Behind me the post receded into the mist. Logs, palisade, the men standing silent on the wall. I did not look back. I swam when I had to, clung to a drifting log when the current grew too strong. Hours passed, or days. I lost count in the gray haze. The owl did not call again. The voices fell quiet. The map stayed dry against my skin, as though protected. I reached the far bank at dusk, pulled myself onto wet grass beneath the willows. My clothes clung cold. My hands shook. I built no fire. I sat with my back to a trunk, opened the map one last time. In the failing light I saw new lines, faint as though drawn while I swam, a trail leading north from the post, past the Osage villages, into the tall grass where no white man had yet claimed dominion. At the end of the trail, a single word in fresh ink: rest. I closed the map, buried it beneath a flat stone at the base of the willow. Then I walked north, following the new line that had appeared, carrying nothing but the brass button and the weight of the answer I had given. Years later, men would speak of a ghost on the prairie, a thin figure with spectacles, walking the old trails, map in hand, asking no questions but listening to the wind. They said he sought the place of many buffalo, though the herds had moved on long before. They said he never aged, never tired, never spoke, and sometimes, on still nights, a barred owl would call from the grass, soft and patient, "Who cooks for you?" And the answer would come back, faint as memory, "I do." Jean-Baptiste Laveau was never seen again at Fort Carondelet. The post itself stood until 1804, when American surveyors arrived after the Louisiana Purchase and found it half-rotted, abandoned by its last Spanish garrison. Osage oral histories from the early 1800s speak of a white man who returned a talking skin to the elders near the Osage River, a map of trails and valleys marked with apologies in ink. The elders kept it for a generation, then burned it in ceremony when American wagons began crossing their lands. Descendants of the voyageurs who remained in Missouri, families with names like Dubois, Marcel, and Laveau, settled along the Missouri River Valley, some becoming farmers, others fur traders who worked for Manuel Lisa's company. None spoke openly of the map, though old men in their cups sometimes mentioned a barred owl that asked questions no one dared answer. Today, faint traces of Fort Carondelet appear on early American maps near the Osage, Missouri confluence, labeled simply Old Post, long since reclaimed by river and prairie. In the 1790s, Upper Louisiana, Missouri Territory, was under loose Spanish control, with trading posts like Fort Carondelet serving the Osage fur trade. Spanish officials commissioned maps to assert boundaries amid growing American and British interest. Explorers and surveyors faced real dangers: ambushes, disease, betrayal, while mapping valuable resources, lead, beaver, buffalo grounds that could shift power among tribes, traders, and empires. The Osage guarded territorial knowledge fiercely. Sharing sacred paths or hunting grounds with outsiders often led to conflict. No documented incident exactly matches this tale, but the era's tensions, imperial mapping as a tool of control, native resistance to knowledge theft, and the isolation of frontier outposts, created fertile ground for legends of maps that spoke or demanded payment in blood and silence.